The first time Marshall Calloway walked into the Redemption Creek Community Church, he did not know a single hymn, could not find a single passage in the worn leather Bible they handed him at the door, and spent the better part of 45 minutes staring at the back of Mae Shepard's head like a man who had just seen water after 3 weeks in the Sonoran Desert. That was the spring of 1878, and Redemption Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that had been carved out of red dust and sheer stubbornness by people who believed that if they prayed hard enough and worked harder still, the land would eventually love them back. The church sat at the east end of the main road, white-painted boards that needed another coat, a bell tower that leaned just slightly to the left, and a congregation of about 60 souls who knew each other's business before they knew their own. Mae Shepard had lived in Redemption Creek her whole life. She was 23 years old, the school teacher, the daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Shepard, and the kind of woman who made an entire room feel quieter and more purposeful simply by walking into it. Marshall Calloway was 26, a trail hand who had ridden up from the Pecos River country with a cattle drive that had deposited him and 3 other cowboys in Redemption Creek when the rancher who employed them, a barrel-chested man named Gideon Holt, decided he liked the grass and the water rights and intended to set up a proper spread outside of town. Marshall had no particular plan. He had a horse named Cisco, a bedroll, a good saddle, a Colt revolver he wore more out of habit than menace, and a reputation among the other hands as a man who was quiet, dependable, and occasionally funny when he thought no one important was listening. He had not been inside a church since he was 9 years old, and his mother had dragged him to a canvas tent revival outside of San Angelo. He was not opposed to God exactly, but he and the Almighty had an arrangement that was more nodding acquaintance than close friendship. Then he saw Mae Shepard. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the day before that first Sunday sermon. He was walking out of the general store with a tin of tobacco he did not strictly need and a peppermint stick he absolutely did intend to enjoy, and she was walking in the opposite direction carrying a stack of primers and readers that was threatening to topple. She did not ask for help. She was managing perfectly well, chin tilted up, step certain, her dark hair pinned neatly under a small straw hat. But a gust of wind came down the road with the kind of personal vendetta that West Texas winds were famous for, and it took the top 3 books clean off the stack. Marshall caught one before it hit the ground. He was not even entirely sure how he moved that fast. He just did. She stopped. She looked at the book in his hand and then up at his face, and her eyes were the color of creek water in late afternoon, a kind of shifting green-brown that changed depending on the light. And she said, "Thank you," in a voice that was measured and polite and gave absolutely nothing away. He handed it back. He retrieved the other 2 from the dust of the road. He handed those back too. "You are very quick," she said, and there was the smallest possible suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I have had a lot of practice catching things before they fall," he said, and then he had no idea what to do next because he had not thought past the catching. She nodded once, settled the books more firmly against her chest, and walked on. He stood in the middle of the road for a long moment. Cisco, tied to the hitching post outside the store, looked at him with the patient contempt of a horse that has seen everything. "Do not say a word," Marshall told the horse. The next morning, he was in the second pew from the back of the Redemption Creek Community Church, holding a Bible he had borrowed from his bunkhouse wall and had not opened, when Mae Shepard walked in with an older woman he would later learn was her aunt, Clara Shepard, who had come to live with me after her father's death 2 years prior. Mae wore a dress the color of summer sage and carried herself the way women carry themselves when they have never once in their lives required anyone's permission for anything. She sat in the third pew from the front. She set her small bag down beside her. She took out her own Bible, opened it with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was going, and settled in. The new pastor, a man named Reverend Elias Cobb who had arrived only 6 months before from a church in Tennessee, began his sermon on the subject of patience and how it was the particular grace that God demanded most of his people in hard country. Marshall sat very still and tried to look like a man who attended church every week of his life. He failed at that almost immediately because he crossed his legs the wrong way for the pew width and knocked his knee against the wooden seat rest of the pew in front, with a sound that made 3 people turn around. The woman directly in front of him, Mrs. Hattie Prout, gave him a look that could have cured leather. He straightened up, put both boots flat on the floor and fixed his gaze forward. He got through 20 minutes of the sermon before his eyes drifted, not to Me's face, because he could not see that from where he sat, but to the line of her shoulders and the way she sat so still and attentive. She sang the hymns without looking at the words. She knew them all from memory. He moved his mouth in approximation during the songs and hoped the Lord would credit him for the effort. When Reverend Cobb said his final Amen, people began to rise and filter out into the bright Sunday morning. Marshall stood too quickly, banged his knee again on the pew rest, and then worked his way toward the aisle with more patience than he actually felt. He wanted to reach the door before she did. He wanted to be outside and positioned in a way that looked completely natural and accidental when she came out. He did not quite manage it. She came out second, just behind old Samuel Greer, who moved at the pace of a man who trusted that wherever he was going would still be there when he arrived. Mae held the door for Samuel. She stepped out into the light. She put on her hat. Marshall was standing 3 feet away, holding his own hat in his hands and turning the brim in a slow circle the way nervous men do when they need something to do with their hands. She looked at him, the same steady gaze, the same impossibly composed expression. "You are the man from the road yesterday," she said, "with the books." "Yes, ma'am, Marshall Calloway, Mae Shepard." She tilted her head very slightly. "I did not take you for a church-going man, Mr. Calloway." He put his hat back on his head. "I am full of surprises," he said. Her Aunt Clara appeared at her elbow, a small round woman with bright eyes and the manner of someone who had been watching this particular kind of interaction for 40 years and enjoyed it immensely. "Who is this?" Clara asked. "Marshall Calloway," Mae said. "He caught my books yesterday." "Did he?" Clara looked at him with open approval. "Well, that is a useful quality." Mae said she and her aunt were walking home. The Shepard house was at the far end of Redemption Creek, past the feed store and the blacksmith and the little schoolhouse where Mae taught Monday through Friday. It was a good quarter-mile. Marshall asked, with the most careful casualness he could assemble, whether he might walk with them since he was going that direction. He was not going that direction. His bunkhouse was at Gideon Holt's outfit, which was 2 miles north of town and in completely the opposite direction. But Mae Shepard looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Suit yourself, Mr. Calloway," and she walked and he walked beside her, and Clara walked on Mae's other side asking him questions about where he was from and whether his mother was living and what he thought of Redemption Creek, and Mae let her aunt do the talking while she listened to his answers with that same careful attention she gave everything. When they reached the gate of the Shepard house, a white-painted wooden gate that needed a new latch, Mae stopped and turned to face him. "It was kind of you to see us home," she said. "It was perfectly gracious and perfectly impersonal. My genuine pleasure, Miss Shepard," he said. He walked the 2 miles back to Gideon Holt spread in the afternoon heat, with a feeling in his chest that was somewhere between a wound and a revelation. The following Sunday he was back in the second pew from the back. He had arrived early enough this time to get a better seat on the end of the pew, which meant no Neetawood incidents. He had also, during the week, quietly borrowed a hymn book from the church's front table so that he could look at the words to the songs and not have to pretend. He had spent 2 evenings going over them in the bunkhouse by lantern light, while the other hands played cards, and gave him looks ranging from amused to genuinely baffled. Pete Larkin, who was the oldest of Gideon's hands and had ridden with more outfits than he could reliably count, sat across from him one of those evenings and watched him turning the pages of the hymn book. Pete had a face like old saddle leather and the philosophical patience of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything. "You are learning church songs," Pete observed. "I am reading," Marshall said. "You are reading church songs, at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, in a bunkhouse." "A man has a right to expand his horizons." Pete studied him. "This is about a woman." "I am going to bed," Marshall said. "It is absolutely about a woman," Pete said to no one in particular, because everyone else in the bunkhouse was already asleep. He learned the first hymn reasonably well by Sunday. He sang it quietly, reading the words, staying half a beat behind the rest of the congregation so he could follow the melody. He got through most of Reverend Cobb's sermon on the subject of perseverance, which Marshall found considerably more applicable to his personal situation than the pastor probably intended. After the service, he was at the door before me this time, and he fell into step beside her and Clara on the road home, and this time me asked him one question. "What is it you do, Mr. Calloway, when you are not attending church services?" "I am a trail hand," he said. "Working for Gideon Holt out north of town." She nodded. "My father used to say that cowboys were the most restless of God's creatures." "Your father sounds like he knew his cowboys." "He knew a great many people," she said, and something moved behind her eyes, quiet and complicated, and he did not press it. At the gate she thanked him and went inside. Clara, trailing behind, gave him a long look and a small nod that felt very much like encouragement. He went back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He went through April and into May, through Reverend Cobb's extended series on the minor prophets, and a particularly demanding stretch in which the pastor tackled the book of Job over 3 consecutive Sundays, and Marshall sat through every word of it. He learned 4 more hymns. He began to recognize the other regular congregants. Hattie Prout and her husband Edgar, who ran the dry goods, Samuel Greer, the oldest man in the county, young Dolers and Rafael Vega, who had come north from Laredo and ran the best small cafe in town, the Harmon family with their 6 children who occupied an entire pew, and Doc Birch, the town's only physician, who was one of the few men in Redemption Creek who had shaken Marshall's hand on his first Sunday and seemed genuinely glad to make his acquaintance. Each Sunday he walked me and Clara home. Each Sunday the conversation was polite and careful and from me's side extremely measured. She was not cold. She was thoughtful. She asked him things in a way that suggested she was actually listening to the answers, which was not a quality he had encountered with great frequency. He learned, over those walks, that she had grown up in Redemption Creek and intended to stay in it, that she had been the schoolteacher for 4 years, and believed firmly that educating children was the most important work available to a person in a frontier town, that she had read every book she could get her hands on, including several that her father's congregation would have raised eyebrows at, that she could not abide cruelty to animals or deliberate unkindness to children, that she had a dry, precise sense of humor that appeared only occasionally and without warning, and that when it did appear, it was devastating. He learned that her father had died of a fever 2 years before, and that it had changed the shape of her world entirely. Thomas Shepard had been the pastor of Redemption Creek Community Church for 15 years, and he had also been Me's primary companion and intellectual partner, the person she argued with and laughed with and reached for when anything significant happened. His absence was a constant in her life, not an acute pain anymore, but a chronic one, the kind that reshapes rather than dissolves. He also learned across 6 Sundays that she had not once invited him in, had not once used his Christian name, had not once given him any indication that his Sunday morning appearances were anything other than a mild, tolerated quirk of an acquaintance. He learned this because Clara told him very directly on the 6th Sunday when Me had gone inside and left Clara to latch the gate. "She is careful," Clara said. "She has always been careful, even before Thomas passed. But she is also paying attention, whether she shows it or not." "I have noticed she pays attention to everything," Marshall said. Clara looked at him steadily. "She had a suitor before you arrived. A man named Crawford Tiggs. He had a claim east of here and a fine enough face, and he said everything exactly right, all the time without fail. Me could not trust him because of that, because nothing is ever exactly right all the time, and a man who never slips is a man who is performing, not a man who is being. Marshall turned his hat brim in his hands. I am not performing. No, Clara said. I can see that plainly. You are a man who is genuinely, absolutely, somewhat desperately trying, and that is a different thing altogether. She smiled, warm and direct. Keep trying, Mr. Calloway. He kept trying. The seventh Sunday brought the first summer heat rolling in from the south, and the church, with its small windows and its packed congregation, became significantly less comfortable. Marshall sat through it without complaint. He had also, by this point, managed to speak with Reverend Cobb before, and after services often enough that the pastor had stopped giving him the measuring look of a man assessing a wolf in a sheepfold, and had begun treating him like an actual member of the congregation, which felt both more comfortable and considerably more complicated. Cobb was a decent man, earnest, a little stiff, but genuinely invested in his flock. He had taken notice of Marshall's consistent presence, and one Sunday after the service caught him before he reached me and her aunt. Mr. Calloway, Cobb said, I wonder if you might be willing to assist with the repair of the side door next Saturday. We have a small work party planned, and I find myself short of men who are good with tools. Marshall was actually very good with tools. He had spent 2 years before trail work as a carpenter's apprentice in San Antonio. He said yes without hesitation. He showed up Saturday morning and found Mae Shepard there as well, because of course she was, because she apparently had a hand in every significant function of Redemption Creek's communal life. She was painting the fence that ran along the church's east side, working with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything. He set to work on the side door, which needed new hinges and a planed edge where the wood had swollen. They worked in adjacent silence for a while, and then she came over to hold the door steady while he worked on the hinges, because she had noticed it was slipping. You know carpentry, she said, watching his hands. I do. San Antonio a few years back. That seems a long way from trail work. Life tends to move in unexpected directions, he said. He was very aware of her hands on the door frame, 3 inches from his. So I have found, she said. They worked together for 2 hours that Saturday, and by the end of it she was calling him Marshall without the Mr., and he was so careful not to react to that in any visible way that he bit the inside of his cheek and tasted copper. The summer deepened. The Sundays accumulated. He learned, through Pete Larkin's network of information that extended to seemingly every person in a 50-mile radius, that Crawford Tiggs had come back to town in June and had called upon me at her house. He learned this on a Tuesday and spent the rest of that week in a state of controlled misery that he directed into the most productive period of fencing work Gideon Holt's outfit had seen in a year. Pete watched him pound fence posts with an expression of deep sympathy and no intention whatsoever of saying something useful. You could just tell her, said the youngest hand, a 20-year-old from Amarillo named Denny Bright, who was new enough to think that the obvious solution was the one worth stating. He could, Pete agreed. Or he could continue to attend church every week and build up goodwill the way a man banks money against a hard winter. What is that supposed to mean? Denny asked. It means, Pete said, that some things cannot be rushed and some women cannot be told. They have to arrive there themselves, and a man who understands that is a man who might actually get somewhere. Marshall said nothing. He drove another post into the red Texas earth with a force that was more satisfying than it should have been. He found out what had happened with Crawford Tiggs from Clara, not through gossip, but because Clara simply told him on the following Sunday after church, while Mae was saying something to Dolores Vega about school supplies. Crawford came by, Clara said. He brought flowers and spoke very prettily. Mae listened to everything he said and then told him she was not interested in beginning a courtship at this time, and he left. Marshall absorbed this. Was she all right? Clara looked at him with an expression that suggested she found this question precisely as revealing as it was. She was quite fine, Clara said. She made a pot of tea and read for the rest of the evening and seemed very settled in herself. "Good," Marshall said, and he meant it, and Clara knew he meant it, which was apparently something she found significant enough to file away. The Sundays of late summer brought new textures to the church services. Reverend Cobb had moved from the Old Testament into the epistles, and his sermons became more direct and personal. The congregation had, over the months, apparently accepted Marshall's presence as a fixed condition of their Sunday mornings. Hattie Prout had stopped giving him the leather-curring look and had progressed to a firm handshake after the service. Edgar Prout talked to him about cattle prices. Samuel Greer told him long stories about the founding of Redemption Creek, in which the facts became gradually more creative as the telling progressed. Doc Birch occasionally sat with him in the back pews and leaned over during the sermon to make quiet observations that were simultaneously respectful of the pastor and gently ironic, and Marshall found he liked the doctor considerably. It was Doc Birch who first asked him directly, one Sunday in late August, keeping his voice low while Reverend Cobb read the announcements. "You come a long way for a church service," Birch said. He was a compact, precise man of about 40 with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who listened more than he spoke. "The preaching is good," Marshall said. Birch looked at him sideways over his glasses. "Marshall, I am a doctor. I spend my professional life reading people. You are sitting in a church you did not previously attend every single Sunday, dressed in your best clothes, sitting in a pew where you can see the back of that woman's head." Marshall was quiet for a moment. "Is it that obvious? To me, Clara Shepard knows. Doller's Vega guessed by the third week. Edgar Prout remains oblivious, but then Edgar Prout once failed to notice that his barn was on fire until the roof went. Does she know?" Marshall asked, and there was something under the question that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but lived in the narrow space between them. Birch thought about it. "Mae Shepard is the most perceptive woman in this county," he said finally. "So I would say that the relevant question is not whether she knows, but what she intends to do about it." Marshall looked at the back of Mae's head. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, listening to Cobb read through the upcoming ladies' auxiliary schedule with the same focused attention she gave everything. "I am patient," Marshall said. "Yes," Birch agreed. "I have noticed that also." The September Sunday that changed things was not dramatically different from any other September Sunday to look at. The air had begun to cool fractionally. The quality of the light had shifted toward that particular golden clarity that Texas puts on in autumn, and Reverend Cobb preached on the nature of honest speech, on the obligation to say plainly what is true rather than hiding behind the comfortable shelter of implication. After the service, walking me and Clara home, they passed the schoolhouse where the windows were open and the chalk dust smell came out into the road, and Marshall looked at the building with genuine interest. "You have been teaching here 4 years," he said. "Almost 5 now," Mae said. "What do you teach them that matters most? Not the reading or the sums." "The thing that matters most." She was quiet for a long stride, and he recognized that quiet as the one she used when she was actually thinking rather than forming a polite response. "That they do not have to stay small," she said finally. "This country makes people feel small sometimes. The land is so large and there are so few of us out here, and the distances are so enormous. Some of the children come in already feeling crushed by it before they are even old enough to understand why. So I teach them that their minds can go anywhere. That learning is a form of freedom that cannot be taken by weather or distance or circumstance." Marshall said nothing for a moment. "Your father taught you that," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time there was something in her face that was not composed, that was slightly open, slightly surprised at being understood. "He did," she said. They walked the rest of the way to her gate in a silence that felt completely different from all the previous silences. When they arrived, Clara, who had been conducting an extremely involved internal negotiation for the past half a block, announced that she had left something at the church and needed to go back, and was gone before either of them could respond. Mae watched her aunt disappear back up the road with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "Your aunt is remarkably inventive," Marshall said. "She is," Mae agreed. "She is also entirely transparent when she wants to be." They stood on either side of the gate. Mae had her hand on the latch. She was looking at him with that assessing, careful look that he knew very well by now, the look that meant she was deciding something. "Marshall," she said, and his name in her voice was a specific thing he felt behind his sternum. "Why do you come every Sunday?" The question hung between them in the September air. He could have said many things. He could have said he had grown to appreciate the community, which was true. He could have said he had developed a genuine regard for Reverend Cobb's preaching, which was also true. He could have assembled a careful, reasonable answer that would have kept everything comfortable and open and unresolved for another 10 Sundays at least. He did not do any of those things. "Because of you," he said. "I come because of you. I walk you home because walking beside you on a Sunday morning is the best part of my week, and has been since the first Sunday I sat in that pew. I am not looking for anything from you. I am not asking anything. I just wanted you to know the true reason because you asked me plainly and you deserve a plain answer." Mae looked at him. The Creekwater eyes were very still. "That is a very honest thing to say," she said. "Reverend Cobb just gave a whole sermon about honest speech," Marshall said. It seemed relevant. Something shifted in her face then, the smallest movement, like the first give in an ice-covered river in early spring, not the break, but the signal that the break is coming. "I have known for some time," she said quietly, "why you came. I am not as unobservant as I perhaps allowed you to believe. I know you are not." She looked at the gate latch under her hand. "I have been careful," she said. "More careful, perhaps, than is entirely necessary. My father used to say that I trusted the land and the sky and my books far more readily than I trusted people, because the land and sky and books do not pretend to be something they are not." "That is a fair observation," he said. "You have not pretended," she said. "In all these months, you have not tried to seem like something different than what you are. You came every Sunday and you learned the hymns and you helped with the church door, and you have been exactly the same every single time I have seen you, which is such a rare quality in a person that I do not quite know what to do with it." He was very careful and very still. "Me," he said. "You do not have to do anything with it." "I know," she said, and then, "Would you like to come in for supper on Friday evening?" The question was simple. The weight of it was enormous. He knew what it cost her, what it required of that careful, protected interior of hers, and he treated it accordingly. "I would like that very much," he said. She nodded once, the way she did when she had decided something. 7 o'clock, she said. "Clara makes a very good roast." "I will be here at 7, he said. She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment, and then he put his hat on his head and walked back toward Gideon Holt's spread, and this time the 2 miles felt like approximately no distance at all. Pete Larkin was sitting on the bunkhouse porch when he got back. Pete looked at his face and immediately said, "Something happened." "I have been invited to supper on Friday," Marshall said. Pete absorbed this. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the sky with the expression of a man offering private thanks for a long-delayed resolution. "Well," he said, "about time." "Do not," Marshall said. "I am not saying a word," Pete said. "I am simply enjoying the evening air." Friday came with the slowness that Fridays always have, when there is something to anticipate on the other side of them. Marshall rode into town on Cisco, having taken the better part of Thursday evening to ensure his good shirt was clean and pressed, which he had accomplished by asking Dolores Vega at the cafe if she knew anyone who took in laundry. And Dolores, who had figured out the situation approximately 6 weeks after Doc Birch, had pressed the shirt herself and charged him exactly nothing, saying only, "You bring her flowers, Marshall Calloway, or I will never speak to you again." He brought flowers. Dolores had told him where the Harmon family's garden was, and Mrs. Harmon, who was a person of great warmth and even greater curiosity, had cut him a very fine bunch of late-season wildflowers that grew along the fence, purple and yellow and white, and she had wrapped them in a piece of cloth and said, "You are a good man, I think," in the tone of a woman who had been watching and had arrived at a verdict. Mae opened the door when he knocked at 7. She looked at the flowers and then at him, and the expression that moved across her face was quick and private, and then it was composed again, but he had seen it. "Come in," she said. The Shepard house was exactly what he had imagined, and also nothing like what he had imagined, which is the only way any real thing can be. It was full of books. Every available flat surface had books on it, and the shelves that lined the sitting room wall were too deep in places, paper-bound and leather-bound, and some that were so worn they were held together with string. There were also flowers from Mae's own small garden in a blue jar on the table, and a braided rug in the hallway, and on the wall, a framed photograph of a man with Mae's straight nose and level gaze who could only have been Thomas Shepard. Clara came out of the kitchen and took his hat and said, "You found flowers, very good, sit down, supper is almost ready," and vanished again. He sat. Mae stood at the mantel and put the wildflowers in a second jar and set them next to the first. "She makes the conversation easy," Mae said, not looking at him yet, arranging the flowers with careful hands. "She does," he agreed. "It is a gift. She has always done it." Mae turned. "When my father died, she came the next day, and she has never left. She did not ask whether I wanted her here. She simply arrived and made a pot of soup and went through the practical necessities of the first terrible week, and then she stayed. I have never adequately thanked her." "I do not think she is doing it for thanks," Marshall said. Mae looked at him. "No," she said, "she is not." Supper was roast beef and potatoes and green beans from Clara's kitchen garden and cornbread and a dried apple pie that was extraordinary. Clara directed most of the table conversation with the skill of a conductor, asking Marshall about San Antonio and about his life before trail work, drawing him out in a way that was genuinely interested, and allowed Mae to listen, which he understood by now was Mae's preferred mode for the first stages of anything. He told them about his family. His mother, Vera Calloway, who still lived outside of San Antonio, and who wrote him letters that managed to contain both genuine love and substantial disappointment that he had not yet settled down in approximately equal measure. His father, gone since Marshall was 12, a horse injury that nobody in the family liked to talk about with precision. His younger sister, Ruth, who had married a schoolteacher in Austin and had a 2-year-old boy named James and another baby on the way, and who was, according to his mother's letters, very happy. "Do you miss them?" Mae asked. It was the first question she had directed at him all evening, and it was not a small one. "Yes," he said simply. "I have spent a lot of years moving, and I am not sure any longer what I was moving toward." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "My father used to say that most people are looking for the same things," Mae said. "A place that holds still, people who see them clearly and choose to stay." "Smart man," Marshall said. "The smartest I have known," she said, and her voice held it without cracking, which told him how thoroughly she had made her peace with the grief. Not erased it, but integrated it, the way bone heals around an old break and becomes something different from what it was before, but solid. After supper, Clara excused herself to bed with the timing of a woman who had planned this exact moment. Mae made tea and they sat on the small porch in the October evening, and the stars came out over the West Texas sky in their thousands, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. He knew this because the church bell struck 9 o'clock when Clara had left them, and it struck 11 when he finally stood to go. They talked about books, about which ones had changed how they thought. They talked about the town and what it needed, which led to a conversation about water rights and railroad routes that was surprisingly heated and completely absorbing, and he discovered that Mae had opinions about land and law and the future of the Western territories that were specific and well-argued, and exactly as unsparing as everything else about her. They talked about what they believed in the way that people talk about belief in the dark, more honestly than they do in daylight. He told her he believed in the obligation to do useful things and not to harm people, and to leave a place better than he found it. She said those seemed like very good principles. He said they were borrowed from his mother. She said that many of the best principles were. He told her about being 9 years old at that canvas tent revival outside San Antonio, how the preacher had been loud and the heat had been oppressive, and he had not understood most of what was said. But that after, walking home with his mother, she had said to him, "Marshall, whatever God you find or do not find, make sure you treat people the way they deserve to be treated and do the work that needs doing." And he had thought of that sentence hundreds of times in the 20 years since. Mae was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that your mother and my father would have agreed on most things." "I think they would have," he said. When he left, she stood at the gate and he stood on the road side of it, and the situation had a symmetry to the first Sunday months ago that neither of them commented on. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking me," he said. "Marshall," she said his name and paused. "I am glad you kept coming to church." "So am I," he said. He rode back to Gideon Holt's in the dark with his heart absolutely full. October moved through Redemption Creek with the particular beauty of Texas autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold and the air sharpening to something honest and clean after the summer's heat. Mae invited him to supper again the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and the pattern became established in the way that things in small towns become established, quickly and permanently, and with the full endorsement of everyone who had been watching. Hattie Prout told her husband Edgar that it was about time. Dolores Vega told her husband Raphael the same thing. Doc Birch told Marshall during one of their Sunday pre-service conversations that he was very pleased with the turn of events, and also that he had won $2 from Dolores on a private wager about the timeline, though he declined to specify the terms. Clara began making the Friday suppers 2 courses instead of 1, and still excusing herself immediately afterward, which Mae acknowledged with the kind of sibling exasperation that crosses the lines of generation. "She is enormously obvious," Mae said one Friday evening, watching her aunt's retreating figure with fond irritation. "She is on your side," Marshall said. "That is not a small thing." Mae looked at him. They were on the porch again, the place where it seemed their best conversations lived. She had her shawl around her shoulders and the tea was between them on the small table he had fixed the second week because the leg had been unsteady. "You fixed the table," she said, looking at it. "The leg was loose. You did not ask me, you just fixed it." "It needed fixing," he said. "I did not want to make a ceremony of it." She looked at the table for a moment. "Crawford Tiggs brought me flowers every time he came," she said. "Formal flowers arranged with a ribbon. He announced them when he gave them. He expected to be thanked at some length." "The flowers you actually want," Marshall said carefully, "are the ones the person brought because they thought you might like them, not the ones that are meant to demonstrate that a flower was brought." Mae turned and looked at him with an expression so direct and unguarded that it stopped his breath completely. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." The preaching shifted to the parables, and Marshall had been going long enough now that he could find Matthew and Luke without hunting through every page, and he sang the hymns without looking at the words anymore, which Clara noticed and told him with the private satisfaction of an advocate watching a long campaign reach its conclusion, that his voice was actually quite decent. "Higher praise I have never received," he told her. "Do not let it go to your head," she said. The thing between him and me built the way real things build, not dramatically, not in one transformative moment, but in accumulation, in all the small things that only reveal their weight when you stack them together. The way she had started talking as they walked to church, not just listening while Clara asked questions, but initiating, telling him about a student who had surprised her, or a book she had finished, or a problem with the schoolhouse roof that she needed to address. The way she had started sitting with her chair turned slightly toward him at the supper table. The way she had begun, carefully and without fanfare, to trust him with the more complicated parts of herself, the grief and the doubt and the fierce private opinions and the humor that came out without warning. He had learned to make her laugh, which was one of the singular achievements of his life. He felt. Her laugh was not the practiced, polite sound she gave to general social situations. It was sudden and real, an expression of genuine surprise, and it appeared on her face first in the eyes before it reached her voice. He had made it happen twice in one evening in November, and he had been so quietly, overwhelmingly pleased with himself that he had not been able to wipe the expression entirely off his face for the ride home. Pete Larkin had been awake when he got in and had looked at him once and said, "Good evening," in the tone of a man who already knows the answer. "Excellent evening," Marshall confirmed. "Denny," Pete called across the bunkhouse. The Amarillo kid stirred in his blankets. "You owe me $1." There was a series of muffled objections from Denny's corner. Marshall took off his boots and sat on his bunk and felt the particular quality of happiness that is not fragile, that is grounded in something real, and he thought about the way Mae's eyes had looked when she laughed, and he let himself have the feeling without trying to manage it. December arrived with a cold snap that brought frost to the creek bottoms and a stillness to the mornings that made everything look precise and outlined. Reverend Cobb announced on the first Sunday of December that the church would have a Christmas social on the 20th, and that everyone was welcome, and that there would be music and dancing and food brought by the congregation. The announcement caused a ripple of pleasure through the pews. Marshall sat in the second pew from the back, which he still occupied out of habit even though he could have moved forward now without social awkwardness, and thought about what the announcement meant in practical terms. After the service, he walked me and Clara home in the crisp December air, and Clara, who had been waiting for an opportunity, created one approximately 8 seconds after they left the church steps. "The Christmas social," Clara said. "Marshall, you will go, of course." "I was thinking I might," he said. "You should ask me to dance," Clara said. This was so direct that even she seemed slightly surprised at herself. Well, someone had to say it. Mae was looking at the middle distance ahead of her with an expression of supreme patience. "Thank you, Aunt Clara," she said, in the tone people use when they mean the precise opposite. "I would like to," Marshall said, because he was not going to waste the opening. "If you would like to, Mae." A pause, the frost-crunchy road, the sound of their boots. "I would like to," Mae said, and she was looking straight ahead, but there was color in her face that was not entirely the cold. Clara's expression was that of a person who has just watched a very satisfying hand of cards played out. The week before the social, Gideon Holt called his hands together to discuss the coming season. Gideon was a large, forthright man who had built his spread from nothing and managed it with a combination of genuine skill and an iron belief in honesty. He told them that he was expanding the herd in the spring, which meant more work, more hands, and for the reliable men, a permanent position with real wages rather than the seasonal arrangement they had been on since the summer drive. He looked at Marshall when he said reliable men with a directness that was clearly deliberate. After the others had gone, Gideon kept Marshall back. "I have been watching you," Gideon said. "You are the best man I have had in 10 years. You think ahead. You do not cut corners. The other hands respect you. I want to make you foreman." Marshall was quiet. "I would expect you to be here permanently," Gideon continued. "This would be a settled position. I need someone who is staying." "I am staying," Marshall said. He said it without hesitation, and as he said it he understood it was true, had been true for a while now, that Redemption Creek had become the place he was not moving away from. "I would be honored, Gideon." Gideon stuck out his hand and Marshall shook it, and the deal was made in the way deals were made in that country, with a handshake and an understanding that both parties were serious. He told me about it on the walk home from church the following Sunday, the last before the social. He told her carefully, watching her face. "Foreman," she said, "permanent position. I will be here. I am not intending to go anywhere." She kept walking. He watched her profile against the December sky. "You told me once," she said, "that you did not know what you had been moving toward." "I know now," he said. She looked at him then, fully, and what he saw in her face was a woman who had been careful for a long time and was deciding whether to be less careful, not carelessly, not recklessly, but deliberately and with full awareness of what she was doing. It was the most courageous thing he had ever seen anyone do. "I am glad you know," she said. The Christmas social was held on a Friday evening, the schoolhouse cleared of its desks and decorated with cedar boughs and red ribbon. Lanterns hung at close intervals so the whole room glowed amber and warm against the December dark outside. Every family in Redemption Creek had contributed food, and everyone had come, from Samuel Greer and his good coat to the Harmon children, who were contained only with great effort by their parents. Rafael Vega had brought his guitar, and 2 other men had fiddles, and they played in the corner, and the music was excellent. Mae wore a dress the color of deep water, blue-green and fine, and her hair was down for the first time he had seen, or mostly down, pinned only at the sides, and she looked so completely and catastrophically herself that he stood in the doorway when she came in from the other end of the room, and simply looked at her for a moment before he could move normally again. He found her beside the food table talking to Dolores Vega, who saw him coming and got out of the way with the same unsubtle precision that Clara deployed. He brought me a cup of the hot cider that someone had set on the stove to warm, and she thanked him. "You look very well," he said. She looked at him. "So do you," she said, and she was not performing a compliment, she was stating a fact, which was so entirely me that it reached somewhere deep in him. They talked for a while with various people, the social ease of a community that knew itself well, and then the music shifted to a slower piece, and he put out his hand and she looked at it, and then she put her hand in his and they moved out onto the floor. She danced well. He had taught himself years ago out of necessity at trail-end celebrations, and he was good enough to lead confidently. They found the rhythm together with an ease that felt like everything between them, practiced and natural all at once. "You did not step on my feet," she said after a turn. "Give it time," he said, and she laughed, that real sudden laugh. And then she was looking at him in the warm lantern light with her hand in his and her other hand at his shoulder, and he thought with complete and absolute clarity that he was going to spend a very long time with this woman if she would have him. They danced twice more. Clara danced with Doc Birch, who turned out to be an excellent dancer, and Pete Larkin danced with Hattie Prout when Edgar was distracted by the food, and Denny Bright attempted to charm 2 of the Harmon girls who were old enough to be at the social and too sensible to be charmed by him, and Samuel Greer sat by the door and told stories to anyone who slowed down long enough to listen. When the music changed to something very slow near the end of the evening, Marshall was standing beside me, and without discussing it, they both stayed where they were and danced again. This time he was more aware of the closeness of it, her hand warm in his and the scent of her hair in the lantern-warmed air, and she was very present, very there, not performing the dance but actually in it. "Me," he said quietly, because they were close enough that it did not need to carry. "Yes," she said, equally quiet. "I should tell you something." She did not pull back. She stayed as she was and looked at him. "I have been in love with you since approximately the first Sunday I walked into that church," he said. "I have been careful about saying it because I did not want to pressure you, and because I thought you deserved the time to decide what you felt without me making it complicated, but I think you should know." She was very still for a moment, the way she was still when she was actually thinking, and then she said, "I know." "You know," he said. "I have known for some time," she said, "and I have been thinking about it for some time as well." She looked at him with complete directness. "I do not use the word love carelessly, Marshall. My father taught me to be precise with it, so I am not going to say it tonight because I want to say it when I am certain." "All right," he said. "But I want you to know," she said, "that I am closer to certain than I have ever been about any person who was not my father or my aunt." The song ended. They stood on the cleared schoolhouse floor, and it was as honest and clear as anything he had ever experienced in his life. "That is enough," he said. "More than enough." "Good," she said. Clara, appearing from absolutely nowhere, placed herself beside them and said, "Are you 2 done with whatever that was?" "Because there is still pie, and I intend to have another piece, and one of you should walk me over there." "I will," Marshall said, and offered her his arm, and Clara took it with the triumphant air of a general who has successfully concluded a long and complicated campaign. Christmas itself was 3 days later, and Mee had asked him to come for the day. He brought his mother's recipe for a sweet cake that Vera Calloway made every year, and he had acquired the ingredients from Hattie Prutt's store and made the thing himself in the Holt Outfits kitchen on Christmas Eve, which had caused considerable comment from everyone who witnessed it. Christmas at the Shepard house was the three of them and the holiday and the warmth of a house that knew how to hold people well. Clara had brought down Thomas Shepard's old Bible and read from the Christmas passages after supper, and Marshall listened with attention that was both learned and genuine, and when she finished, he said that it was a very fine reading and meant it. They sat by the fire after, and Mee told him about Christmas when her father was alive, the traditions of the holiday in the Shepard house, the things Thomas had done and said, and the songs he had liked, and she talked about it without the closed, careful quality she usually brought to those memories, openly, willingly, letting him in. He listened the way he listened to her completely. Later, when Clara had gone to bed and the fire had burned low and the night was quiet around the house, Mee said, "Marshall, yes, I have decided, I am certain." He looked at her. "I love you," she said in the precise, considered way she said things she meant completely. "I thought you should know." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and she turned her hand in his and held back, and they sat there by the dying fire, and the winter dark outside was very still, and he thought that this was what the word home had been meaning all along, not a place but a person, not a location but a specific gravity, and he had found it. "I love you," he said back, and it was just as simple and just as enormous as that. Spring came to Redemption Creek the way spring always did in that country, explosively, a matter of days between the last freeze and the first wildflowers, the creek running high and cold, and the sky turning that particular shade of deep blue that made you believe in things. Gideon Holt's foreman work kept Marshall fully occupied through March and into April, the expansion of the herd bringing its complications and demands, and he met them with the steady competence that had made Gideon hire him in the first place. He and Mee had settled into the rhythm of people who have decided on each other. He walked her to and from church every Sunday, which was now the source of open affection from the congregation rather than speculative observation. He had supper at the Shepard house on Fridays. He helped her when there were things to be done, fixing the fence latch that had needed it since before he arrived, and rebuilding the small porch step that had cracked in the winter cold, and one Saturday helping her repaint the interior of the schoolhouse before the new school year's start. They disagreed sometimes, genuinely, with the vigor of two people who each had real opinions and did not soft-pedal them. There was the matter of the proposed fence line between the Holt property and the Greer family's claim, in which Marshall had a professional perspective and Mee had a community perspective, and they argued it out on the front porch one evening with considerable energy, and came to no resolution except that both their positions had more merit than either was prepared to fully concede, which Clara, listening from inside the house, found extremely satisfying. There was also the matter of Marshall's continued relationship with the church. By April he had been attending for a full year, and Reverend Cobb, in one of his quiet conversations with him before the service, had asked him directly whether the faith he was building was genuine or circumstantial. Marshall considered the question seriously. "When I started coming," he said, "I will tell you plainly that it was for me, but something happened over the months that I was not expecting. The community of it. The sitting together and singing together, and the particular kind of being with people that this room seems to produce. I do not know that I have arrived at every article of faith, Reverend. But I believe in this community and my place in it and in the obligations that creates." Cobb looked at him for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I have heard worse definitions of faith from people who have sat in pews all their lives." In April, On a Tuesday evening when he had come to see me and they were sitting on the porch in the early spring warmth, he asked her. He had the ring. He had been carrying it for 3 weeks, having ridden to the county seat at Lacey and found a jeweler there, a patient man who had helped him select a simple gold band with a small garnet, because he had learned that me did not like excess or performance but appreciated craft and care, and the ring was well made and the garnet was the color of creek mud in certain lights, which he thought fit her. He did not make a speech. He held the ring and said, "Me, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at him. She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was long enough that his heart did something structurally alarming. "Yes," she said, simply, completely. "Yes, Marshall, I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, and then she looked at him and leaned over and kissed him, her hands on either side of his face, which was the first time she had kissed him, and it was everything, warm and deliberate and entirely her. Clara, from inside the house, said, "Well, finally," at a volume that suggested she had been listening at the window for some time. They got married in June. Reverend Cobb officiated in the Redemption Creek Community Church on a Saturday afternoon when the whole town came. Me wore a dress of ivory lawn that Clara had helped her make, her hair simply arranged with a circlet of the wildflowers that grew along the creek bank. Marshall wore his best coat and his best boots and had even had his hair cut by the barber, which Denny Bright had claimed made him look like a completely different person, and Pete Larkin had said made him look like a man who was getting married, which was exactly correct. The ceremony was short and honest. Cobb did not overdo it. Marshall and me spoke their vows to each other with complete attention, looking at each other directly, each word measured and meant. When Cobb said he could kiss the bride, Marshall kissed her, and the congregation applauded with the enthusiasm of people who had been watching this particular resolution for a year and were very satisfied with the outcome. Samuel Greer, sitting in the front row, had tears on his face and seemed unbothered by them. Doc Birch was smiling the precise, private smile of a man who had called it correctly from week 3. Dolers and Rafael Vega were radiant with second-hand joy. Pete Larkin stood in the back and looked at the scene with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of the world and found this particular corner of it entirely sufficient. Denny Bright cried, and absolutely denied it to everyone including himself. The reception was held in the cleared churchyard, tables set out and every household in Redemption Creek having contributed food, and there was music from Raphael's guitar and the 2 fiddle players from the Christmas social. They danced, Marshall and me, in the June afternoon, and there was nothing careful about it, nothing measured, just the 2 of them in the sunlight with the whole community around them and the summer air full of food and music, and the particular satisfaction of a day that is exactly what it should be. Clara danced with Doc Birch again. Pete Larkin danced with Dolers while Raphael played, and Raphael watched with fond amusement. The Harmon children created considerable chaos that their parents managed with varying success. When the music slowed, Marshall held me close, and she rested her forehead against his jaw, and they moved in the long afternoon light, and he thought about the first Sunday in that pew, the cannonball crash of his knee against the wood, the first sight of her shoulders and the line of her back and the composed set of her head, and the distance between that moment and this one, which was enormous in every way that mattered. "Mrs. Calloway," he said quietly. She lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes in the summer light were very green. "Yes, Mr. Calloway," she said. "I am very glad I went to church." Her smile was the real one, sudden and lighting everything. "So am I," she said. They moved into the Shepard house, which became the Calloway house, though everyone in Redemption Creek continued to call it the Shepard house out of the deeply ingrained habit that small towns form around addresses and never fully break. Clara stayed because that was never in question, and she occupied the back room and ran the kitchen, and inserted herself into their lives with the comfortable integration of a load-bearing wall. Marshall built a proper study off the back of the house for me, A small room with a window that faced east and bookshelves along 2 walls and a writing desk under the window, because she graded her students' work at the kitchen table, and he thought she deserved a room of her own for the intellectual life she kept as carefully and seriously as any other part of herself. He did the carpentry himself, evenings and weekends through July, and when it was done Mae walked into it and stood in the center and looked at the shelves and the window and the desk and did not say anything for a long time. "Marshall," she said finally, "if you do not like the desk position I can move it," he said. "Do not touch the desk," she said. She turned and looked at him, and her face had that open quality, the one that he had first seen in September on the road outside the schoolhouse, the one that meant he had understood something about her accurately. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it the way she meant everything completely. He kissed her forehead. "You are welcome," he said. He worked the Holt spread as foreman, and found that the work suited him as few things in his life had. The combination of outdoor physical labor and the organizational thinking and the management of men, which he did with the kind of authority that comes from genuine competence rather than performance. Gideon Holt was a fair employer and a decent man, and they developed a working relationship that had real respect on both sides. In the fall of that first married year, Mae told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a quiet Sunday evening after the church walk, when Clara had gone to make tea and left them on the porch. She told him with the directness she brought to everything, and with something underneath it that was vulnerable, carefully held. He took her hands and looked at her and said, "Me," and could not immediately find another word, which she apparently found sufficient, because she leaned into him and he held her in the September evening. "Are you frightened?" he asked eventually. "Some," she admitted. "It is a large thing." "It is," he agreed. "We will manage it." "I know we will," she said. "I am not frightened because I doubt our ability to manage. I am frightened because it is enormous and I respect enormous things." "That is the most Mae Calloway answer that has ever been given to any question," he said. She laughed against his shoulder and then she sat up and looked at him. "You are going to be a good father," she said, with the precision she used when she was stating a fact rather than offering comfort. "I have observed how you are with the Harmon children and the students when they stop by, and with young Denny Bright, who needs considerably more guidance than he usually admits. You are patient, and you do not talk down, and you notice when something is wrong. Those are the things that matter." He was very still for a moment because what she had just given him was not a compliment. It was a considered assessment from the most careful observer he knew, and it reached the part of him that had carried his own father's absence as a specific kind of uncertainty for a very long time. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That is why it means so much." Clara, bringing the tea, looked between them and read the situation with her usual accuracy and set the tray down and said, "Well, there are things to be done and I will enjoy doing all of them." And that was essentially Clara's entire response to the news, which was warm and direct and exactly right. The baby was born in May of 1880 in the Calloway house, with Doc Birch attending and Clara assisting with the focused efficiency of a woman who had helped at more births than she usually admitted. It was a long night and Marshall was in the hall for most of it, which was where he was supposed to be, and he sat on the bench outside the bedroom door and listened and prayed, genuinely, with the faith of a man who had been building it for 2 years in a church pew and was now calling on it directly. A boy. Red-faced and enormous-voiced and absolutely perfect in every particular, which Marshall assessed in the first 30 seconds of holding him, and was not objective about in any way whatsoever. They named him Thomas for Mae's father, Thomas James Calloway, the James for Marshall's maternal grandfather. Mae, tired and wholly herself, held the baby and looked at Marshall and said, "He has your chin." "He has your eyes," Marshall said, which was true, the shifting green-brown of the creek. "Poor child," Mae said, which made him laugh. Thomas Calloway grew into a child of very decided opinions and enormous energy, and the kind of persistent curiosity that keeps adults in a state of permanent alertness. He was walking by 10 months and asking questions that required actual answers by the time he was 2.5, and me taught him with the same care and seriousness she brought to her students, and Marshall read to him in the evenings with a consistency that the boy came to regard as a fixed law of the universe. Clara adored him with complete and unreserved partisanship. Doc Birch, who delivered him, became his honorary uncle in the way that family accumulates in small towns around people who matter to you. Pete Larkin, who had retired from trail work and taken a less demanding job at the Holt Outfit stables, showed the boy how to brush a horse before he was 3 and declared him a natural, which was not strictly accurate but was the kind of encouragement that mattered at that age. In the summer of 1881, Gideon Holt told Marshall he intended to expand south and take on a second section of grazing land along the creek bottoms, and asked whether Marshall wanted to manage the whole operation or stay with the original spread. It was a significant offer, more responsibility, more pay, and a vote of confidence that was explicit and generous. Marshall talked it over with me, as he talked everything over with me, because she was his closest counsel on anything that mattered, and she had thoughts about the practical implications and about the community implications, and by the end of the conversation he had a clear picture of what he wanted to do and why. He took the expanded position. It meant more work and longer days through the cattle seasons, and me managed the household and the school and Thomas with the same capable efficiency she brought to everything, and it was not without strain. The long days and the exhausted evenings and the perpetual negotiation of 2 full lives running alongside each other. But they managed it honestly, saying when something was difficult, addressing things when they needed addressing, not letting the small resentments accumulate into something worse. They fought about the school roof again, which had developed a genuine problem that the town council was slow to address. Marshall thought the council needed to be pushed harder. He thought the council needed to be approached strategically. The argument went on for 2 evenings and was eventually resolved when they combined their approaches, and the council fixed the roof. Doc Birch said it was the most productive marital disagreement he had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed many. They fought about Denny Bright, who had gotten himself into trouble in the fall of 1881, a card game gone badly that had left him in debt to a traveling man who was not patient about being owed money. Marshall wanted to handle it one way and me wanted to handle it another, and they were both partially right. And between their 2 approaches and some support from Pete Larkin, and a frank conversation involving Reverend Cobb and the traveling man, the situation was resolved without permanent damage to Denny or anyone else. Denny was so grateful that he eventually stopped being an idiot about card games, which was the best possible outcome. They argued sometimes and laughed more often, and sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything. They were not people who ran out of things to say to each other, which turned out to be one of the most essential facts of a shared life, that the conversation did not empty out. In the spring of 1882, me told him she was expecting again. This time he was less frightened and she was less frightened, and Clara simply said, "Good," and began making practical plans. The second child was a girl, born in October. They named her Clara Vieira. Clara for the aunt who had been the architect of so much, Vieira for Marshall's mother, which made Vera Calloway cry when she read the letter and which contributed, along with the existence of grandchildren she had not met, to her decision to make the journey from San Antonio to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1883. Vera Calloway was a small, iron-willed woman of 52 who had raised 2 children alone after her husband's death, and had done it without complaint and without losing her fundamental warmth. She arrived on the stage from Lacey in April, and Marshall met her at the stop and took her to the house, and she walked in and saw the books and the children and me, and she stopped in the hallway and looked at her daughter-in-law with the particular assessment of a woman who has been wondering about the person her son has become. Me met the look with her own level gaze. "He wrote me about you," Vera said. "He has told me about you," me said. "What did he say?" That you told him to treat people the way they deserve to be treated and do the work that needs doing, Mae said, and that he had been thinking about that for 20 years. Vera looked at her son. You told her that? Yes, ma'am, Marshall said. Vera looked back at me. That is the best thing anyone has ever quoted me, she said, and something decisive happened in her face, a judgment made and delivered, and she opened her arms and Mae stepped into them and it was done. Vera stayed 6 weeks, which was 6 weeks of 2 iron-willed women learning to share a kitchen and a household, and they managed it because they were both fundamentally practical, and because they liked each other genuinely, once the initial measurement was complete. Thomas adored his grandmother immediately and without reservation. Baby Clara Vera was held by Vera with the focused reverence of a grandmother with her first granddaughter, and Vera cried again, privately, which Marshall witnessed from the doorway and which he was wise enough to say nothing about. When Vera left, she hugged me for a long time and said something quietly in her ear that Mae did not repeat, and Marshall did not ask, because some things belong to the women and have nothing to do with him. The years of Redemption Creek settled into the shape of a life that had been built deliberately and well. Marshall ran Holt's outfit with competence and fairness that built him a reputation across the county, not a famous reputation, not the kind that got into dime novels, but the real kind, the kind that means when a man says he'll do something it gets done, and when he makes an agreement it holds. He was on the town council by 1883 and helped broker the water rights arrangement that the Greer family and the Holt outfit had been circling for 2 years, which was not dramatic but was important, because water rights disputes in West Texas could go very badly very quickly, and settling them sensibly was genuine work. Mae ran the school and ran it well. She was the best teacher Redemption Creek had ever had, and several of her students went on to further education in San Antonio or Austin, and wrote her letters that she kept in a box on the study shelf. She advocated for the school's resources with the town council with a patience and persistence that got results, and she was regarded by essentially everyone in the county as a woman worth listening to, which was how she regarded herself, and she was not wrong. Thomas started school at Mae's school, which she and Marshall had discussed and agreed was potentially complicated, and had decided to do anyway because the school was there, and Thomas needed it, and Mae was professional enough to handle being his teacher as well as his mother, which she was. Thomas was clever and restless, and Mae was neither softer nor harder on him than on any of her other students, which he found deeply irritating and which was exactly right. Clara Vera, called Vera at home because 2 Claras was occasionally confusing, was a quieter child, more observational, with her mother's stillness and her father's eyes, and the particular gravity of a child who is absorbing everything and will have opinions about it later. Clara the elder adored her namesake and was adored in return, which created an alliance of considerable influence in the household. On their 5th anniversary in the summer of 1883, Marshall and Mae sat on the porch in the evening while the children slept inside and Clara sat in the kitchen with her needlework, and the creek sounds came from down the road, and the stars were out in the enormous West Texas dark. 5 years, Mae said. 5 years since the wedding, he said. 6 years since the first Sunday. She looked at him. You count from the church. That is where it started, he said. She thought about that. You sat through an entire year of sermons for me, she said, every single Sunday. Reverend Cobb is an excellent preacher, he said. Marshall. He is, but yes, for you, every Sunday was for you. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. He knew this quiet, all its varieties, and this one was the one she used when she was about to say something that mattered. I am very glad I let you walk me home, she said. He reached over and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 5 years, not ceremonially but naturally, as if her hand was something that belonged in his and his belonged in hers. So am I, he said. The church bell on the other end of Redemption Creek struck 9, and inside the house, Vera called Vera stirred in her sleep and Thomas turned over with the firm efficiency of children who sleep deeply. And Clara the elder set down her needlework and hummed something quietly. One of the hymns, the melody clear in the kitchen warm air. Me leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his chin against her hair, and they sat in the summer night while the creek ran and the stars wheeled overhead in their thousands, in their vast and indifferent and somehow also comforting enormity. And it was the very particular piece of people who have built a life together that is actually what they wanted and actually what they are. The Sunday after their anniversary, Marshall sat in the second pew from the back. He still sat there, out of habit and out of some private fidelity to the beginning of things. Me sat in the third pew from the front where she had always sat, and Thomas sat beside her in the determined posture of a boy who has been told to sit still and is doing his level best, and little Vera was between me and Clara, her small back very straight, me's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Reverend Cobb preached on gratitude. He spoke about the forms of gratitude that are spoken and the forms that are lived, and how the second form is rarer and more complete than the first, and how a life lived in active gratitude is the closest approximation most people will ever reach to the state of grace. Marshall listened. He looked at the back of me's head, as he had looked at it for 6 years, and the feeling was the same as it had been in the beginning, that arrested recognition, that certainty, but layered now with everything that had been built on top of it. The walks and the suppers and the porch evenings and the arguments and the laughter and the children and the ordinary extraordinary dailiness of a life that belonged to both of them. After the service he came down the aisle and me was waiting with the children, and Thomas grabbed his hand immediately because there was something he urgently needed to tell his father about a matter of justice that had occurred in the schoolyard on Friday, and Vera called. Vera lifted her arms to be picked up, which he did, settling her against his shoulder, where she immediately began investigating his collar button with focused curiosity. Clara came alongside with the warm satisfaction she carried through every day of her life as a permanent condition. They went out into the Sunday morning, the whole town around them, the familiar road ahead, the Shepard Calloway house at the far end of it with the garden showing the last of the summer flowers, and the study window reflecting the light, and the sign me had made for the gate that read simply Calloway in letters she had painted herself with the same care she brought to everything. Marshall walked beside me, Thomas between them pulling him forward, Vera on his shoulder looking at the world with her mother's seriousness, and the sun was warm on the road, and the creek was running somewhere below them with the sound that had been the background of all these years. "Do you ever think about that first Sunday?" Me asked, not looking at him, watching Thomas navigate the road with the thoroughness of a child making a project of it. "Often," he said. "You look so out of place," she said, and there was that laugh in her voice, the real one, underneath the words. "You were holding the Bible upside down for at least 20 minutes. "I was," he said. "I thought if I looked at it long enough it would become right side up." She laughed then, fully, and Vera looked at her mother's laugh with the pure delight of a child who has learned that her mother's laugh is one of the best sounds available. Thomas, not wanting to miss something, looked up. "What is funny?" "Your father," me said. Thomas considered this. "Is he always funny or only sometimes?" "Only sometimes," me said. "But when he is, it counts." Thomas accepted this and returned his attention to the road. Marshall looked at me over their son's head, and she looked back at him, and everything that had been built between them was there in the look, the whole of it. "Come on then," she said, and she took his arm, and they walked home. They walked home through the Sunday morning, through the familiar streets of Redemption Creek, past the church with its white boards that still needed another coat and its bell tower that still leaned slightly left, past the dry goods and the cafe and the blacksmith and the schoolhouse with its freshly repaired roof, through the gate with its new latch that worked exactly as it should, and into the life they had chosen and made together, one Sunday at a time. Clara had dinner on the stove when they arrived, and the house was warm and full of the good smells of that, And Thomas immediately had 14 things to do, and Vera immediately needed to be set down, because there was something of tremendous importance on the floor near the hearth that required investigation. And Clara said grace before the meal in her direct and heartfelt way, thanking God for the food and the family and the particular gift of ordinary Sundays. Marshall sat at his place at the table and looked down at me, who was settling the children with the patient efficiency of a woman who has done this enough times to do it without thinking, and she caught him looking and raised an eyebrow the smallest amount. "Grateful," he said. She understood. She always understood. "Good," she said. She sat. "Then let us eat." And they did, all of them together, in the house that had always been a home and was more one with every passing year, in the town that had been carved out of red dust and stubbornness by people who believed that if they worked hard enough and loved well enough, the land would eventually love them back. Outside, the Redemption Creek church bell struck noon, clear and steady in the blue Texas sky, and the sound carried all the way down the road and through the window and into the kitchen where they sat. And Marshall heard it the way he heard it every Sunday, with gratitude, with the specific knowledge of what it meant to him and why. With the full and quiet happiness of a man who had found his place in the world by sitting in a pew he had no business sitting in and walking a woman home who was entirely too good for his sideways and stumbling approach, and who had let him love her anyway, wholly and without reservation, for the rest of their days.